Welcome to the 9th Annual Langbein Lecture. I'm Ken Potter, President of the Hydrology Section. Pleased to see you all here. The Langbein Lecture was established to recognize lifetime contributions to the science of hydrology and unselfish service promoting cooperation in hydrologic research. The lecture commemorates the remarkable career of Walter Langbein. Langbein made original contributions on a number of fundamental problems in hydrology and geomorphology, and at the same time worked to facilitate the application of basic research results to the management of water resources. The topical diversity of Langbein's contribution is remarkable. He made significant contributions on closed lakes, evaporation, soil temperature, storm flow generation, floods, reservoir storage, sedimentation of lakes and rivers, and river form and processes. He advanced the theory of the design of hydrologic data collection methods and worked tirelessly to promote the development of international hydrologic networks. I should also note that Langbein made notable contributions to the American Geophysical Union, serving with Alan Kanisa as one of the founding editors of Water Resources Research. It is most fitting that Steve Burges has been selected to give this Langbein Lecture, as his career is also distinguished by diverse contributions to hydrologic sciences, successful application of science to water management, and dedicated service to AGU. Let me begin by mentioning two of Steve's contributions to AGU. He was co-editor of Water Resources Research from 1980 to 1985. As one of his associate editors, I came to appreciate both the depth of his hydrologic insight and his dedication to AGU. As section president in 1994 to 1996, Steve set a standard of leadership that has greatly challenged those of us who followed. Like Walter Langbein, Steve has contributed fundamental and applied research on a wide range of topics, including flood frequency analysis, hydrologic forecasting, analysis and modeling of hydrologic time series, reservoir storage design, rainfall runoff modeling, and hydrologic impacts of land use change. For his many research contributions, Steve has been elected AGU Fellow, as well as Fellow of the American Society of Civil Engineers and the American Association for the Advancement of Science. A central theme in his research is understanding the uncertainties associated with measuring, characterizing, and predicting hydrologic processes, particularly as these processes relate to the management and use of water resources. Today, he will present us with his current insights on hydrologic variability and its societal importance. This is a most timely topic given the widespread occurrence of flood and drought conditions in the world today. I am most pleased to welcome Steve Burges to this year's Langbein Lecture.
Thank you, Ken. The title is Hydrologic Variability, and it's a huge range in topic, and in the process of doing it, I had to constrain the topic. First of all, I have to thank the Langbein Lecture Committee, Mary Anderson, Wolf Brutzart, and Harry Linz for inviting me to be the lecturer, but more importantly, the opportunity to read or reread many of Walter's papers. If you've not had a chance in the last 5 or so years to read some of Walter's papers, one of my all-time favorites of Walter's is this particular piece in one of the finest publications ever put out, Water, the Yearbook of Agriculture. And the particular point is the water in the rivers and creeks. It says more about hydrology than most modern textbooks are able to say in 300 pages. The major theme for this lecture is to deal with the forms of variability in annual and to a lesser extent seasonal river flow volumes and the associated issues of water supply and water supply reliability. The topics that I want to go through here, first of all, are annual flow volume variability and demand in the United States, the conterminous United States. Then I want to go through and discuss annual flow patterns and persistence. I want to discuss issues about data needed to define variability. Then I want to go to the storage reservoir problem and stochastic considerations, and bring in something about storage size involving seasonal to annual to multi-year issues. Then I want to go with an illustration of what would form a natural lab, which is the Perth water supply for Western Australia. I'd like to return to the United States and indicate our vulnerability because of the levels of demand we have, and then I'll try and tie it together. So a little quiz for the audience. Who here has calculated summary statistics for annual river flow volumes? Groundwater people are exempt, okay? Show of hands. Not a lot. Well, this is going to be a tough quiz. What fraction of the conterminous U.S. rivers have annual flow volumes coefficient of variation, that's standard deviation divided by the mean, greater than about 0.2, 0.4, 0.6, or larger? This really matters. What fraction of mean annual river flow volumes is extracted or controlled? This is what people call a physical demand for societal or ecological use. At what fraction of annual water demand do the magnitude of CV, or the form of the marginal distribution, become, and any form of persistence, become major issues in water supply reliability? Fortunately, we have a marvelous data set that many people have used, and it came as a result of an extraordinary effort by Urata Landwehr doing QA/QC checking, and I'm showing it for the 18 water resource regions. Map just showing you these. The first locations, the lower numbers are in the hydrologically more benign area to the east, and the higher numbers to the west. And the regions, or the little dots on that map, represent the locations of where stream gauges have been used for the statistics that will come up as follows. I am enormously grateful to Rich Vogel and his colleagues for the work that they've done in a series of papers starting in 1998, and in particular for a picture of the coefficient of variation across each of these regions for annual stream flow volumes, and also for pulling out from information from Corps of Engineers and FEMA data, reservoir demand divided by the mean annual river flow. Now, first up, the particular figure you're seeing up here shows two issues of current climate and future, and I'm not the least bit interested in the future. What I am interested in are these guys in here, the solid dark portion, and they're showing you coefficient of variation. So the low regions in here, they're the eastern part, and we have coefficient of variation. These are box plots, typically above 0.2 and on the order of a bit below 0.4. But let's get over the other part of the country, and we see numbers that are typically on the order of 0.5 or higher and substantially higher. Now let's go a little further and look at the fraction of water that's extracted for controlled use where there are reservoirs. You come over to the more benign part of the country, and you're seeing regions of 60 to 80% of the mean annual flow extracted and controlled for use. And we come across to the other part of the country, and you start seeing some numbers where the numbers getting up there on the order of 0.7, and we go across there 0.5 or so is not an uncommon number. So 50 to 70% of the mean annual flow and higher is getting to be quite an issue, and you'll get to see these numbers are extremely important. Walter Langbein spent a lot of his career looking at issues. In a paper in 1944 with Hoyt, the yield of streams as a measure of climatic fluctuations. Municipal water use in the United States, Journal of the American Water Works Association. Few people here probably read that. Remember, Walter was the founder of Water Resources Research in 1964. Safe reservoir yield, long-term changes. That was a very, very significant paper in 1950. He got into the stochastic nature of reservoirs, and he introduced queuing theory to the topic, and that was in 1958 in the American Society of Civil Engineers. A USGS circular, water yield and reservoir storage in the United States. And I think the last piece of work Walter did before he died, or must be very close to it, was an open file report, Reservoirs and Withdrawals for Water Supply Historic Trends. Harry Limbs very graciously got me a copy of this. That's the front cover, complete with USGS's label on the front. But there are two extremely important figures in this report of Walter's. It has up here reservoir capacity in millions of acre feet Note the good units. Fresh surface water withdrawal in billions of gallons per day. These are the numbers the industry understands, scientists may not. And there he plots the numbers up there, and notice up here, 1980, there's storage versus withdrawal, but he also has on there a bit of analysis from Clayton Hardison's work, which was largely about the 2% risk of failure. That's largely a within-year failure mode, the once-in-50-year kind of thinking of issue. We can't use that now because we're on longer-term topics. But the other thing Walter had in this marvelous report was there's the potential limit up there of about 1,100 million acre-feet of storage that's possible topographically in the United States. Withdrawal purposes, you see something peeking out in there, and you notice the year, 1980 up to there. All purposes going up to there, roughly about 500 million, but notice the plateauing. And we'll see something more about that a little later in this presentation. Well, that's the prelude. I now want to go and discuss some annual flow patterns and persistence, and I have a few that would represent the range of what we're likely to see. I have a low annual coefficient of variation for the Cedar River of Washington, which is one of the major water supplies for Seattle, my hometown. I have an example of high annual coefficient of variation and high skew for the Salt Verde system in Arizona. I have another one for Perth, Western Australia, where we're dealing with high coefficient variation and a changing pattern of skew. And I have another illustration from the Colorado River with multi-decade swings from highs to lows. So first of all, the Cedar River in the Washington state. We're looking up here where the max is roughly 500 million acre-feet a year. We're looking at water years starting in 1929. I had some problems with Excel, that's why the year doesn't appear on the bottom. Many of you have had comparable problems. And the thing I'd like to mention there, look at those, they go up, they go down, they wander all over the place, and some statistics. Coefficient of variation 0.23, that says roughly 4 standard deviations below the mean before you get into negative territory. This is so close to Gaussian you wouldn't know the difference. Lagrange correlation of 0.25 and a skew of 0. That only tells part of the story. If we plot the cumulative sum of departures from the mean, now this is something that Hurst showed people in 1951, and we start out there, we simply take the quantity in year 1 and subtract the mean from it and save that result. Same for year 2 and just take the cumulative sum. So you're looking at a low frequency kind of a run come down there, but notice down there we go through about 10 years of below mean quantity. We pick up there of a rising condition and come down. Now there's a Hurst statistic which is a measure of lumped, aperiodic, low frequency kind of stuff. I repeat, aperiodic, lumped all together, and if you end up with a number higher than about 0.5, it's fairly persistent, and there's a Hurst K. It could be an error, but it's at least telling you there's a high persistence in there. And this is something that will come through in quite a few things I want to show you. If I go to the Salt Verde system, we're dealing with Phoenix, the water supply for that region. Phoenix is one of the fastest growing cities in the United States. It's an enormously important issue for water there. The data I have here are from John Keane from the Salt River Project, and they were published in 1991, and they show you an extremely interesting pattern. The numbers as we go up there, the top number there corresponds to 5 million acre-feet. The average across there, that line going across there, is 1.2 million acre-feet. But the thing that notice, there are very large swings, and there are times of quite a few years, we're looking at an annual scale now that goes from 1900 to 1990 that are substantially below the mean. Okay? So here we have a case with big quantities with respect to reservoirs that can fill them, and then sustained periods of low. And this gets to be a significant issue. The way that system is operated is in a mode that I call cyclic storage, and it's a term that was introduced by Harvey Banks in 1953, and my colleague Dennis Lettenmeyer and I had a crack at this problem. We were looking at combinations of surface and groundwater supplies. The idea is one would recharge for many years and pump for many, many years. It's quite a different idea than conjunctive use. The information we have here is from John Keane, 1974, through 1990, these are the inflows. So we have low years of inflow, high year of inflow, low years of inflow. This is the groundwater pumping. So heavy groundwater pumping when the surface water flow was low, and when the surface waters are high, more of that's used and less in the way of pumping and recharge taking place. So the important part is, though, you're looking at multiple years of these kinds of issues. Now, this comes at a cost. There's treatment involved there, and it's a very expensive issue, and you're talking about serious management issues that come into play. I need to go across now to the country of my birth. I grew up in Australia. Most people are familiar with roughly that side of the world, having watched the Olympics and the nation at party towards our fall. But I want to go over across this side to Perth, Western Australia, and I'll say more about this figure later, but it's mainly to show you where Perth happens to be, for those who haven't been down there. The issue there that I want to show is a time series from 1911 to 1994. And this is a big deal. We're looking at the annual volume in gigaliters. Notice I've done acre feet, gallons, a gigaliter. Now, that's 1 billion liters. Most of us don't think in that term, but it's an enormously practical unit. How many people use acre feet in their work at some stage? Show of hands. Okay? All right, an acre and a foot deep. A gigaliter is a meter by a kilometer by a kilometer, one of the most practical units you could ever get. Okay? So here we're going up there. It is. Kilometer by meter. Come on. Yeah. Okay. All right. You're looking at a cubic kilometer of water on the top scale. That's what it comes down to. The skew here is 0.6, the coefficient variation 0.66, a skew of 1.3. This is a wildly varying, now these are the inflow to the main reservoirs. So you get big guys, little guys, and then you get over there and you see a period of about 20 years of reasonably low flow. I'll have a lot more to say about that later. If we plot out the cumulative sum of departures, we see a wobble down there, high points going from the low point to roughly the high point up there, and dividing by the standard deviation gives us a measure of Hurst coefficient, and it says it's highly persistent series. So that's an issue for us of concern. Last case is the Colorado River, the upper Colorado, a much studied part there, and we're looking at Lee's Ferry as the place to comment here. These data are from our colleagues at the Tree Ring Lab in Arizona, and I found enormously important when I first saw them in 1990. The numbers go from 10 million acre feet to 20 up there, and we're looking at decades, starting in 1521, 1531 the next, and up to 1971 up there. The hatched portion represent the 10-year average flow provided by the Bureau of Reclamation as best they could estimate the virgin flow of the river system. The black up there in these guys are what is done by regressing that information against tree rings, so their prediction. So you take a look up there and sort of say, hey, you know, they don't do too badly. They're off a little bit. So that says if you went backwards with tree rings, you'd have some sense of idea of what that variability might be. It may not be correct, but at least gives you something to look at. What it tells us, we go for decades of low conditions, and we can go for decades of high conditions. And this is a norm type condition, so we have to be thinking in terms of those kinds of scales. Here's one I'm going to have some fun with. What data do we need to define variability? Okay, what record lengths are needed to characterize variability? Lots of people are talking about these days, and it's a tricky problem. Well, Walter Langbein addressed this problem at various times during his career, and two papers I'd like to mention. In 1954, the Western Snow Conference. This is an enormously important insight at the time. The population of the country was substantially less than the 285 million it is today. The permanent type stations must be operated so as to maintain a consistent record of the time variations that exist in stream flow from day to day, season to season, year to year, and most importantly, decade to decade. He followed up in the International Association of Hydrology that same year by putting in the idea of a secondary group of stations, a flexible group of temporary or secondary stations supported by a firm network of base stations can rapidly and economically add to the store of useful information on surface water resources. The last that Walter wrote on this was the overview of the Conference on Hydrologic Data Networks in Water Resources Research in 1979, and that was his summary of the Chapman Conference on Network Design that was put together by Marshall Moss and Dave Doherty. That was the only time I got to meet Walter and observe how he would sit quietly, ask questions, and just soak up information, and his review and summary at that time was absolutely a wonderful experience. All right, now let's pose a question. When might we discontinue a record? And I want to use, first of all, two examples. Annual tree ring data from limber pine at Dell, Montana, and I want to use first up a 60-year period of record that centered approximately in 1810 and then a longer record. So here we go. There we have the tree ring growth index, and roughly 100 is the average for the series. And we're looking there, there's year 25, year 75, so roughly 60 years in there. Who here would like the job of trying to tell, if this was now related to stream flow, who here would like to have the job to tell water managers what to expect for the future? Who here would like the challenge of trying to describe what might have happened previously? Well, that's what it was. So you have that kind of variability, a different kind of variability, and back to the pattern. That's enormously important information to have, but notice the length of record to have a prayer of getting there. We're looking at something on the order of 110 or more years before we could say anything intelligent about that. I want to go to the Perth water supply, and now I'll extend the record to the end of water year 1999. And first up, a 60-year period of record. If you had this information, and you had to say something intelligent about what to expect for the future, most people would think they would see a pattern that's going to look a bit like that in the future. 60 years is a long time. Most people would think that. That's what came. If you had that, and that alone, okay, I think hydrologically with models, the ability to do that would be pretty primitive. If you have what this stuff is up here, and you were very, very thoughtful about how you modeled, and you then took rainfall, you might have a chance of getting that about right. But what really matters is this is a lot smaller in magnitude than this, and the designs for society were based on higher numbers. Well, I now want to bring us to the issue of storage reservoir design, because here's where we start, here's where the rubber meets the road. And I want to talk about stochastic considerations. The storage design problem is very straightforward. How large a storage is needed to meet a specified physical demand with a societally determined reliability? And I emphasize societally determined. There's economics and other things in there. If we think about a water supply storage reservoir, the issues are very simple. There are three issues. You have a stochastic river flow pattern. You have a physical demand pattern, which has three parts: the desired societal use, water for ecology, and that is enormously important as more and more issues of Endangered Species Act are used in this country and elsewhere, and losses from seepage and evaporation, and then the rules by how you're operating your reservoir. By putting in a storage, you're providing buffering, and it handles within-year shortfalls. So if you want to put in a pipe and grab some water for some purpose, you'll have some when you want it. It has to handle over-year shortfalls, and it has to handle multiple-year shortfalls on the order of decades. Well, how do people do this? There are all sorts of variations, but realistically, they go back and use Ripple's 1883 mass curve analysis. The analysis used the historical stream flow sequence. The reservoir is operated as if the stream flow is known with complete certainty, which says a perfect forecast, and a single value of storage is provided. The design storage is such the reservoir will just go dry for a brief instant, and the demand is satisfied without any shortfall. That's how it works. The procedure of a mass curve analysis was formalized about 1960 by Professor Harold Thomas and colleagues at the Harvard Water Program, and it was known as the Sequent peak algorithm. A lot of people have used that algorithm thinking that it was different from Ripple's work, but Bitt-Clemish in vintage Bitt-Clemish form showed in 1997 that the two were equivalent. I want to come back to variability information again here and to use information from Rich Vogel, the annual coefficient variation, demand, but he also has mapped out Hurst coefficients for us, which are very, very useful, and annual Langbein correlation. I want to take that a little further. Our regions, again, low numbers in the east, higher numbers in the west. Coefficient of variation, and where I'm wanting to focus now are on these numbers. So you're looking at 0.5, most of them are above 0.5, and you see some that are substantially above 1. Demand levels, let me concentrate over here again for quite a few places. Let me just go 50% of the mean annual flow and higher, and as time goes on, those numbers are likely to go higher for a variety of reasons. The Hurst measure may not be the only way to do this, but it's one thing we have. I'd like to emphasize a couple of things. There's the record length. This is from the USGS record series that's provided by our colleagues with the HCDN. Hurst coefficient up here. Hurst coefficient should be between 0.5 and 1. That's where it should be. So there's obviously scatter down there with shorter records. But Rich has put a lowest filter through there, and it turns out we're looking at numbers in the high 0.7s, getting up near about 0.77 or thereabout. Please notice also there's 80 years, and we don't have many records longer than 80 years. Our colleagues at the survey have updated that list, and we're now getting up to, these records are through 1988. They'll be updated to 1999, but notice how few we have out here of the long kind that really matter. Correlations, Langbein annual correlations, look, about 0.2, and that's a diagram that Rich is particularly proud of, but it's sort of saying we do have some annual Langbein correlation across the regions. So I want to look now at annual scale stochastic patterns. I'll be looking at, largely at this stage, those issues. And I want to consider the demand level that we'd like to extract from a reservoir in the context of the annual coefficient variation and different forms of persistence. This is important for us to do. And the simplest we could do is a lag-1 Markov model, a simple regression, this year's flow on last year's flow, plus a random term. I generated an autoregressive model, normal distribution, mean of 10, coefficient, standard deviation of 5, so it has a coefficient variation of 0.5, so we're at the low end of the numbers I just showed you, and a correlation coefficient of 0.2. I put up there in solid the mean. I put down there a demand of 5, which is 50% of the mean, and I put the other one up there at 7, which is 70% of the mean. What a reservoir has to do is where you see a trough, the reservoir has to be able to smooth that out for you. And you notice when you crank the demand up there, you have bigger troughs to fill in. So that's the story on the simplest kind of persistence that you might have. That is one realization of the story. If I go to a Hurst-type persistence, now we're going to have longer pulls of ups and downs. And I go now, the same story, mean of 10, standard deviation of 5, but I've gone with a Hurst coefficient of 0.77, generated with an ARMA 1.1, and there's the 50% demand level, there's the 70%, and just look at that window in there that we need to do something about it. Well, a quickie lesson in Sequent peak algorithm. What one plots is the cumulative flow minus the demand versus time. This is for a 50-year window that I was looking at. And we run along, and we come to a peak, we come to a trough, come to a peak. In this particular case, for trying to extract 70% of the mean annual flow, in this particular case, we're looking at a scenario where the reservoir was full at the end of year 13. It is empty at the end of year 24, and it fills again at the end of year 33. So somebody could be born and almost graduate from university, and if had good memory as a little baby, would see the water at the spillway level. And about ready to graduate from university, would see the water at the spillway level again. This is very important that we get used to this kind of issue. Well, that's a single value. What we really need to know is some probability distribution of storage. The first person, to my knowledge, to have a crack at this was Alan Hazen in 1914, and he took existing records and spread them out to get a long record. Sudler in 1927 did sampling without replacement and trying to get an idea of a stochastic approach. Barnes in 1954 did sampling with replacement, but he was assuming he had uncorrelated information. And the first group to get this in the correct mode was our colleagues at the Harvard Water Program circa 1960. And the idea there, they used a simple season regression of streamflow volumes. They're looking in that particular case. And the illustration, one of their illustrations was for the Clearwater River in Idaho, which is reasonably benign. How does one come up with a cumulative probability distribution of storage? First of all, you generate a stochastic sequence. It's a four-step process. You need to figure out the storage that's going to meet that demand. Repeat for m independent sequences, and I absolutely emphasize that they be independent. Many pieces of work in the literature are wrong because people violated that and didn't know it. And plot as an empirical CDF. Well, what should that empirical CDF look like? When I was a graduate student, my colleague Gilbert Franz, who is a world-class hydraulic engineer, suggested that, you know, the storage problem is much like Gumbel looking at the flood problem. It ought to be extreme value type 1. So he mentioned that in an afternoon, and I stayed up half the night, maybe all night, running things out, plotting by hand, and plotted them as an extreme value distribution, and tried to look fresh the next day as a 24-year-old kid and said, Delbert, I think I've got it. And here we have a plot on an extreme value type 1 scale, stretched out there to make the distribution, cumulative distribution, linear. Many of you have plotted flood distributions that way. Express storage in inches there for a depth of an average of 1 inch of runoff to the basin, try and normalize it. And we're working with a simple autoregressive process, and the lower quantity down there are the results of 1,000 storages, not all of them plotted, calculated with a coefficient variation of 0.25, really benign case, and extracting 70% of the mean annual flow. The one above it is for a coefficient variation of 0.5, 40-year life, and extracting 50% of the flow, and that one's 90%. Now, let's take roughly that level there, 98% to go up there, and we're looking up there, if you tried to extract 90% of the river flow, you'd need about 6 times the mean annual flow as a storage. So the issue is that it's handy to display this information as an extreme value type 1 plot. Well, if one does this stochastic stuff, is it any good? Could you explain it to anybody? Would they believe it? So Dennis and I had a think about this back in 1981, and we wrote a paper in a conference proceedings. We took 8/10 of the mean annual flow of the demand for the Cedar River, Washington. We generated ARMA 1-1 sequences, and we compared to the historical record. What we have up here is storage divided by the mean, and we have cumulative probability. We actually drew that on a normal probability scale because we needed to show people something in that mode. Clearly, that cumulative distribution is not straight. It is not a Gaussian distribution. The point I want to make, though, is that is the historical value. If you ran the historical sequence by itself, that stuff in the middle is telling you how much storage that you'd need. And it says you'd need about 0.6 of the mean annual flow. But notice, there's the 50% level in there. About half the synthetic sequences gave us storages less than the historic, and about half more. We really don't know what shape this should be, and it's unknowable. But what really matters, when you start getting out to levels of society of concern, that's about the magnitude that they need to be talking about. I want to look now at issues of variability and persistence and see how these interplays all work out. I published a paper with my colleague Kiyoshi Hoshi and Professor Yamaoka in the Japan Society of Civil Engineers in 1978, and it was written in English, and the whole idea was to introduce to our colleagues in Japan some of the ideas of stochastic simulation. And we used an impossibly short record because we needed a local illustration, and it happened to be from Hokkaido. Kiyoshi was with the Hokkaido Development Bureau for most of his career, and it turned out we could transform our data, seasonal or annual, to the Gaussian domain where we needed with a log normal 3 transform. I've yet to see any monthly or annual data that I can't get to be approximately Gaussian with a 3-parameter log normal transform. Okay, so first of all, I want to look at the patterns. We're looking at the monthly distribution in here. Average for those, the dashed are the mean, so about 5% of the mean occurs in December, and we're looking across there, and the big quantity in there, April. Most people who know the region would realize that's snowmelt, and we come across there. The open bar are the coefficient of variation on that scale up there, and 0.6 is the biggest number, and quite a few of them around about 0.3 to 0.4. How much water do we want to extract? Let's go up there. Very little in the winter, pick up in the summer, and drop down again. So that's the seasonal pattern. Then how much? I want to look at 30, 50, and 70% as the levels. It's really benign at an annual scale, coefficient of variation 0.19, so about 5 standard deviations to get to 0. Langbein correlation crudely about 0.4, skew about 0.6, and it looked like it was fairly persistent. So first up, I want to go through and do the seasonal pattern, and that by itself. That's simply regressing month 1 flow onto month 2 flow and going through progressively, generating a sequence and finding out how big a storage you want. All these diagrams are on extreme value pages. If we went through and did this, storage is defined as normalized by the mean, and probabilities out here, so there's the extreme value scale. We ran 500 sequences through, and they all fell on the line and they plotted out well. That's when you want to take 3/10 of the mean annual flow at the annual level with the seasonal pattern I just showed you. That's 5/10 and that's 7/10. Now, why 2 sets of lines? The upper line is if you said, I'm going to say parameters and I'll just treat it as Gaussian. The solid line below is if you try and make the transforms to get it as it should be, and that simply says you'd better do the transform, simply because it's going to cost you a hell of a lot more storage if you don't do that, and you'll pay a price for it. Now, this is only going to get you within-year fluctuations as how you're going to go along. If we now say, let's look at the annual scale and get a bit more persistence in there, and look at the correlation that comes in and disaggregate to monthly volumes, here's what we get. Absolutely no change at the low levels, but we end up with a pattern coming along here. Here is for transform stuff, and there's a kink. What has happened, we've gone from needing within-year flow buffering to over-year flow buffering. Now notice that scale goes up to 0.9, and now let's bring in something with, if the persistence is there, what's happening? So we end up with, these have not changed, these guys have steepened up, and if we took the 98% reliability level, we'd need something about 0.83 times the mean annual flow for storage. If we didn't know this, and we only assumed lag 1 Markov kind of process, we would need about 0.63. Now this is a huge economic difference. And if we really were naive and used the simple seasonal model, we'd need about 0.37, which is totally inadequate. Truth is somewhere between this and the ARMA 1.1 case that we show. We don't know, but it makes a difference. So the consideration of seasonal marginal distributions is essential, and there's no difference between the things at the low level. The annual model needed at a demand of 0.7 times the mean annual flow. Notice that 0.7 number. And the model form matters at high demand, and even for a relatively low coefficient variation, the form of the persistence gets to be important. What causes long-term persistence? The reality is we really don't know, and we need long records to say something about it. But we should always check designs for sensitivity to see how important it might be. Vic Clemish, in a stunning paper in 1974, The Hurst Phenomenon, a puzzle, offered plausible explanations. But the real issue is that the whole issue is a trans-scientific one. It says it's a legitimate question of science, but we don't have the questions or the tools of science to answer, and it remains important. My good friend Ken Potter knocked out a really beautiful illustration of this in 1975 using precipitation data and Hurst-type persistence. And I have here figure 1 from his diagrams, not to test your eyesight. Rainfall at Philadelphia and down here at Charleston, that's 1810 and that's 1980, so it's up through the part there. The point I want to emphasize is it looks like there's a local average up there, it looks like a local there, something else, and something else. They are all of different length. If I go down to Charleston, different length, patterns coming in there, but you can think about changes in means. Anytime I look at a time series that has shuffle changes in it, I don't care what it is, turbulence, I know it will have a fairly high Hurst-type coefficient. What we really would like to know is what causes these. The other parts of the record, quite appropriately Boston, and have something in there. Now you know why I refer to it as a lumped, aperiodic, low-frequency kind of phenomenon. What this really means is long records are essential to identify patterns of persistence. We really need long records. Hence, we've gone back to tree rings and other things and paleo records. All right, I now want to head to Perth, Western Australia, and the reason I got into this, I was asked the question, has the climate changed? So I sweated for a couple of months, this was back in early 1996, wondering what to tell people. But it really fits in the mode of what would be a beautiful natural lab, and the recent NRC committee report on suggested directions for research for the EAR division of NSF. Two issues came up there. One was natural labs, something where it's an issue that's big, something bigger than a long-term ecological research site, and the answer matters to society, and we need to study it for a long time. So big issues. The second thing that came up in that report, and Dick Kerr very, very kindly picked up on this, was we introduced the term critical zone. That's every part of the domain we as hydrologists work in. It's enormously important to a huge range of things. All right. Now, Perth, we're dealing with a water supply. The population served in 1995 was 1.2 million. It's a rapidly growing area. They anticipate 1.7 million in 2001. And it appears that the hydrology may have changed, the surface hydrology, around about 1974. I'm looking now at the record through 1999, inflow in gigaliters again, starting in water year 1911. The long-term average going across there is about 290 gigaliters. The median is about 230. For the total record, coefficient of variation 0.66, quite variable, and skew of 1.4. Let's look at 1971 through 99. The coefficient of variation has dropped off considerably. The skew has dropped off considerably. The mean has dropped off to 170 and the median 138. Now, people had to make decisions on water supplies, and they wanted to know roughly what to anticipate for 1998. And design-wise, the long-term mean up around 300, they were extracting about 65% of the mean annual flow on the long-term mean. Design-wise, it made huge sense what they were doing. This is what they anticipated. They were planning to supply 200 gigaliters in 1998 from surface water. Let's just go back. That is the average inflow for that window that comes into play there. A bit hard to do. The rest from groundwater, now this is enormously important because the region lends itself to both issues, but groundwater has to be treated. It's naturally brackish as it goes through, so you're talking a big cost to do that, and they've been able to bring in more groundwater to handle the shortfall at the time being. The facilities layout, what's it look like? Here we have Fremantle, those of you who are sailors and remember the America's Cup, Perth, up the river, up the Swan River a little more. There's a region of reservoirs in there, and I've put in boxes, and those of you who do your sums realize they don't come up to 100%, but there are 6 reservoirs. They're the 6 main reservoirs that do things. 30% capacity, 27%, and I'll be saying a bit more about that guy, and 9% of this one up here. Precipitation, long-term average, 1,200 there, about 1,000 there. This is not a water-short area. A meter of water is a lot of rain. Okay? So let's have a think about what's on. Now, a sense of scale. We're dealing with 90 kilometers up along here. So we go in there, and at the edge of there's a scarp that comes along there. There's a rise from low level up 300 meters, and the precipitation drops off as it goes backwards. The cumulative inflow to those reservoirs is roughly 255 gigaliters on average, which is 85% of system inflow in the long term. All of the reservoirs were designed to be over-year storages. They're all bigger than the mean annual flow, and they range in size from 1.4 to 6.6 times the mean annual flow. Now, I want to home in on Serpentine Dam. That was 27% of the storage capacity and about 1,200 millimeters of rain. I want to show, first of all, calendar year rainfall. And I have these records through 1994. So long-term average, it comes along there, 1,232, and the window, the last 20 years from 75 to 94, 1,061. I can't think of anything more useless hydrologically than the annual rainfall to tell me anything. I can't think of anything more useless excepting it's wet or it's not so wet, okay? Now, what is important here is back to our map, and we're dealing with a roundabout there for Perth, and we're dealing with winter rain with dry summers. So in about a 180-day period, roughly 80% of the rain comes, so you'll see that it goes in. As you go inland, you're semi-arid with winter rain and so forth. If we look at the rainfall in this part, averaged by month, rainfall in millimeters, and we look at, say, that guy, that's 1911 to 1994. This one is the window 1975 through 94. You go along and you don't see a big change in the reasonably benign time. Rain starts a little bit in April, picks up in May, and goes along there in June. Now, it's dropped off a little in April, maybe 10% or so in May, maybe as much as 20% in June, and other story. Well, how sensitive? We're talking roughly, remember, a bit more than a meter of water a year. That's the resulting runoff response. So we see the effects of antecedent moisture being enormously important. A drop-off about a little less than half normal in June, maybe 55% in July, that relative to that, and dropped off there, and that's partly the description of the huge shortfall that's come. A change in rain patterns and a bit of a reduction has made a huge difference to the hydrology of how this domain works. My colleague Bryson Bates has been looking at this problem, and with colleagues Steve Charles and Jim Hughes, has been looking at downscaling issues of how you can downscale GCM stuff to some rain gauges, and they looked at 30 rain gauges and have found out some interesting things that might tell a story. In this particular 1999 paper, they characterized the broad issues that drive the precip out here. First of all, sea surface temperatures out in the Indian Ocean is very, very important to the whole story. Over this side, El Nino and Southern Oscillation, people have found some things that tell part of the story there. The low pressures coming through here are a big issue, and clearly you're down in this region here and are sensitive to shifts. What my colleagues did, they broke up the rain patterns at these gauges into 6 broad classes. Okay, these very, very broad classes, and these are synthetic surface pressure maps that will come into play. State number 3, you're looking at 30 rain gauges there, and these represents the probability if that approximate pattern happened, this is the probability of rainfall occurring. If this, with a high in the Great Australian Bight, should occur, that represents the probability of rainfall occurring at those gauges, i.e. very little. Now, they had 4 other categories as well, but these particular ones are some that are most interesting. In very recent analysis, Bryson looked at category 3. Now, weather state 3, that's this guy, okay, where if you get that happen, there's a high chance of rain. Weather state 3, starting in 1958, this number here represents, so it's about 0.33, this represents the number of days in that year when that pattern came out of 180 winter days. Now let's look at that. The average across there is, roughly around about 0.3, maybe a little lower. But notice in here, in this window, we've dropped down to about 0.15. There's been a change in the frequency of this rain-producing set of storms. We go across to the drier condition, and there was a lower number, and now we've come to a higher number. So there's been a change in weather patterns, and that's a very, very interesting story. So it turns out that the societally important climate fluctuation pattern and the resulting river flow patterns that come with this provide an excellent opportunity for really multidiscipline investigation of the topic. We don't know what's caused this issue. We don't know what's caused the frequency pattern change or how long the change will persist. That's what makes it even more of a challenge. Let's come back now to the conterminous United States and storage reliability issues, and we're getting close to wrap up. How vulnerable are we to forms of climatic fluctuations? I go back to some work that Dennis and I did and published in 1977, and at the time we had all kinds of issues about how could we generate, back to the storage diagram here, storage in terms of how much you need in terms of mean annual flow. Notice the number 10 up there. At that time, there were broken line models, there was fractional Gaussian noise, there was fast fractional Gaussian noise, and we needed a computational alternative, so we knocked out some work with ARMA 1.1 based on Ender O'Connell's work, and we also came up with another guy. It simply says that the models give us about the same distributions. But what they're really telling us, if we try to extract 5/10 of the mean annual flow, and we have a Hurst coefficient of about 0.7, so this is reasonably benign, and we have a coefficient of variation of 0.5, which is the low end of what we're seeing for the country, these are the numbers we need. If we're extracting 50%, we need maybe about 1.7 times the mean annual flow if we like that reliability level. If we want to get 70%, we're talking a number closer to 4, and of course, if we get up that end, we're asking for trouble. If we include skew patterns, these guys come down substantially. That guy doesn't. And there's some people confused by a 1972 paper thinking that was the issue. For the levels that we're concerned with right now, skew in information of the marginal distribution, the big deal, they've dropped down to 1 and closer to 3. I used to think this was okay until I looked at the Perth problem and then got enormously alarmed. Because if you're modeling that way and you put in there and you bring in something with a skew, there's something implicit there. It better occur reasonably frequently across the record. And here's a case, if you went up to about this window here, you have highly skewed stuff, but you have lower skewed stuff there. You'd have to be enormously careful if you designed and included that to watch for what you're up against. This has been a huge eye-opener for me 20 years after I first had a crack at this problem. Now, to get us into perspective, I've brought up the simple Gaussian case with zero skew, in this case here, storage diagram, and I'll put two numbers there, 95% and 98% reliability. Let's think about what these mean. These are the results of having run 1,000 synthetic sequences, obtained a value of storage, and plotted those 1,000 values of storage as an empirical CDF, and that's the theoretical CDF that goes through it. And it turns out to be a very good fit. So what does 98% reliability mean? It says for 98% of the sequences, I would have, as long as I had a storage of that size over there, I'd have enough water, okay, to make sure I had no shortfall for 98% of all the sequences, and these are linked 40 years. 2% of the sequences, I'd be a bit light on it, that's all, okay? So somewhere between this number and this number is about what society would probably home in on. So it says if you're trying to extract 7/10 the mean annual flow, you'd want maybe between 3.3 and roughly 4 times storage. So you're dealing with a number in around here. If you go higher, you're dealing with a number up there. The U.S. situation, I go back to beautiful work from colleague Rich Vogel. I want to home back in on Walter. A marvelous paper by Will Graf in 1999 that the community saw fit to publish as a technical note. They didn't have the wit to realize its importance. And I want to look at consumptive use of water in the USGS. So first of all, from Rich and colleagues, we're looking now at the storage ratio. How big are the storage reservoirs relative to the mean annual flow? How big are they? All right, so in the benign part of the country, there are very few that are in the capacity of 1 times mean annual flow. We get out there, most people recognize region 14 as part of the Colorado system, and we get out here to the west, we don't have too many reservoirs more than about twice the mean annual flow. From Will Graf's paper, he mapped out regions and provided these numbers in tables. If you looked at the total storage, and he was interested in sediment traps, relative to mean annual runoff, there's your pattern. So you see certain parts there where you have a fair amount of storage, and California looks light, and we see in the northwest looking light. If you look at consumptive use, evaporative use, about a third is evaporated. This is courtesy of colleagues at the Geological Survey, and Harry Linz gave me this one. And we look at other parts. The Colorado, you notice an interesting one that says a bit more than's there, which makes it an interesting challenge. So if you used this one by itself, you wouldn't be bringing in water for ecology and how we need to try and organize stuff for our benefit. Back to Walter's work. He showed water withdrawal purposes coming up here. All purposes, this is hydro and everything else, roughly about 500 million acre feet. And Will Graff had mapped it out based on Corps of Engineers and FEMA data, out about as far as it goes. That's all storages, all purposes, about 800, and the limit Walter had figured was roughly about 1,100, was plateaued. If you break it down by region, again from Will Graff, in the benign regions, we've plateaued. As time goes on, there's the time scales. We've plateaued. Hey, I'm not suggesting we go build a bunch of reservoirs, okay? And we've done that. So the realities are, a lot of the infrastructure is in place. This is reality. So I want to come now and tie up with a summary. And first of all, we're going to have to be paying attention to human perceptions of water supply systems. And as the demands increase, particularly in moderate to high annual CV river systems, the demand fraction will push most of the systems towards overuse storage patterns. That's just going to happen. And water users in regions of significant temporal persistence will have to become accustomed to decadal duration fluctuations in reservoir levels. And that means very careful and skilled management. Just pulling the last parts here with Walter. By any measure, he was a visionary. And he made numerous seminal contributions to hydrologic science. But more importantly, he was acutely aware of the connection between science, data, societal issues, and water policy. And we must never forget that in our work. 50 years ago, in an American Water Works Association paper, he championed the establishment of key gauging stations, and I think you'll pick up why these are even more important. Carefully operated with a view to maintaining consistent long-term records of stream flow as independent as possible from the influences of man. The need for such information will become more impelling as stream development increases, with growing competition for water and consequent narrowing for the margin of error. We have to narrow that very, very much now. There's very little room. It's my hope that in the course of going through this discussion with you today, that I've renewed interest in the importance of examining causes of stream flow variability, particularly under the increasing societal demands for water. Long records are essential, and in some ways, I'm misquoting Lynn Gelhar, our data are absolutely precious.